Hello from React Finland. This time we're going to discuss the topic of documentation. And we have three speakers. One went to pick tea or coffee. But maybe Rachel, maybe you can introduce yourself and your topic a little bit.
Hey there, I'm Rachel. I am documentation manager over at React and React Native. I'm here to chat with you today about how documentation can help your open source project with some tales from the field.
And Michael, maybe you go next because we're waiting for the third speaker to show up.
Sure. My name is Michael Shilman. I lead a project called Storybook, and I'm here to kind of demo Storybook docs and talk a little bit about the philosophy behind documentation in Storybook. It's a work in progress, so it's also a little bit of telegraphing into the future of where we're going with it.
Yeah, let's say, so when Patrick shows up, he can introduce himself, but so maybe we can discuss that topic of documentation. He can introduce himself, but so maybe we can discuss that topic of documentation before we move to the first demonstration. So I mean, what's documentation for you? How do you like? What is documentation? If you think about software projects.
Well, documentation has actually grown to encompass many different things beyond just writing. Usually when you say documentation, you think of a big fat manual or a textbook. But these days, people who specialize in documenting software, they have to be very good at thinking about multiple kinds of media like audio, video, etc. People seek out documentation in many different formats these days. So nowadays documentation might not necessarily mean an API reference book. It might include blog posts. It might include a YouTube channel with tutorials. So it can be a little loose, but very strictly, it's the guides and references you find on a website associated with a project. Yeah.
Do you have anything to add, Michael?
I see documentation as a major headache. Storybook's documentation, although we have a tool for documenting software, has been one of the most difficult things to build and maintain and keep up to date and keep clear. So I don't address any of that in my talk. If I had an answer, that's what I would be talking about. Instead, I'm talking about Storybook itself.
Yeah. And I guess around documentation, you have some kind of process. So the documentation just doesn't appear from somewhere. It's just it takes some consistent effort to create the documentation. So that I guess it's going to be, yeah. So it's not like you yeah.
All right, I thought that was a jumping off point. There's a bit of lag. I love international conferences for this reason. It's like you have to wait 8 minutes to see if the light will arrive from the sun. But anyway, I was just going to say that there's two kinds of documentation. There's fully automated documentation generated from source code, which is kind of meaningless when you read it, unless it can be like this is this. That doesn't tell you what this does. And then you have handcrafted documentation that has to be carefully created by elves in the forest every release, and that's really doesn't scale. And this scales well, but is meaningless. And somewhere in between, hopefully you can automate the stubbing out of documentation, but you have real people who love to write and love to explain things, expanding on that. You need a human touch in there somewhere, but it is like the unanswered problem in software right now. How do you do documentation, meaningful documentation that is useful to people at scale without it becoming like the engineering team's full-time job?
Yeah. It's a hard problem, and I don't know if you ever can solve it. And now we have Patrick. So Patrick, maybe you can tell a couple of words about yourself and your talk today.
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Patrick Ecker. I'm working for a Finnish company called Ruja Oy, which is building a product which is actually a sales enablement platform to help our customers having a better sales workflow and such. It's built in React, of course. And I'm also in my open source time working for the ReScript project, which is a programming language, like an open source programming language targeted for React developers and JavaScript developers. And there I'm working at the core team, mostly working on the documentation infrastructure and mandatory tooling and meta language. And yeah, and this is also going to be an interesting topic I'm going to talk about today, maybe.
Yeah, very, very cool. And now we have our MC as well, because we had some technical issues. So I will jump out and let Sarah take it from here.
Sarah, we can't hear you.
Can everyone hear me now?
We can hear you now.
Oh my god. So now I have internet, a microphone, and speakers. How insane is that? So sorry about that. The computer that I usually use was just not connecting to the Wi-Fi. It was just not having a good time, so I had to switch to the work computer. So welcome to my work computer. Yeah, so first of all, welcome to everyone that's here as a speaker, here as an attendee, and just everyone that's here. I would like to apologize again because apparently I don't understand how computers work. No one does. They're black magic. Yeah, so everyone has already introduced themselves. I am just here to say that our first speaker will be Rachel. Rachel is pretty impressive as a person and as a developer, and she's looking at me weird. I don't know if everyone can see that, but I wanted to make sure that I said that Rachel is someone that I truly admire in this line of work, in this duty that we have. And I am sure that her talk will be amazing. And yeah, take it away, Rachel.
Hi there, I'm Rachel Nabors, content manager on React Core, working with React, React Native, and Relays documentation. I led the effort to reboot React Native's documentation in 2019 and 2020, and currently I am leading React's documentation overhaul in the middle of this pandemic. Yay! I'm super sad because last year I was going to give a talk about the React Native documentation, and I was really looking forward to coming and seeing you all in Finland. I have been waiting for this conference for so long. So this year, I'm pretending that I'm in Finland anyway, and I have set up my portable sauna just for this occasion. There are many ways to support your community, but one of the most scalable ways is documentation, and that's what I'm here to talk with you about today. Docs tend to grow organically. They start out usually as code comments in somebody's project, eventually becoming readmes or a change log. Usually the two come hand in hand together, and these tend to evolve into a documentation portal and a blog. But docs are a lot of work. This is a snapshot from the start of our React documentation journey. Now, content sheets like this are used by people who write books to keep track of which content needs to be written, what stage it is in editing, and this is what a major documentation push feels like. It's like writing a book. Now, your project may not have this scale of effort that needs to go into documenting it, but this is the end game of documentation right here. Docs are work. Writing a book is work. It's not something you do in your sleep. It's definitely not the same as commenting your code. Documentation is a lot of work, but that's because it also does a lot of work. Documentation is a developer's best friend. So many people develop with documentation open in another window in the background to reference as they go throughout their work week. It's a great starting point for newcomers. Often people are going to interact for the first time with your repo or your project through the documentation. A canonical source of material for educators, people who want to make their own training materials, maybe teaching a meetup class or a boot camp, or even at a university. It helps them to have a source of truth that they can go to and know that what they're teaching is factually correct. It's also an excellent adoption point for launching new features. You made a really cool new feature, you want to tell everyone about it, well, it helps to be able to link to API pages that explain how to use the new feature and implement it. And of course, answering a searcher's questions. A lot of people go to Google, they type in a question for a problem that they're having, or they just want to find like the size and shape of an API, and Google returns search results. This doesn't quite work for, searching for videos. And sometimes, if you're lucky, maybe the answers on Stack Overflow are correct. But ideally, that first search response will be a canonical piece of documentation that people can rely on and answers their questions. Our 2020 React Native user surveys showed that most respondents were using the documentation daily and weekly. Over on React, surveys showed that there is a shift towards monthly referencing the documentation, probably due to the smaller API, or possibly because there's such a wealth of alternative materials. What was really interesting was seeing how different resources in the communication are used in tandem by React Native learners. 70% of React Native developers, whether they're in production or learning for the first time, reference React's documentation daily, weekly, and monthly. Now, good documentation is a stepping stone to proficiency. It removes barriers to entry. 80% of React developers, for instance, started learning with our documentation, freely available in multiple languages. No college tuition required. When your documentation is available widely and easy to understand, it means that people can get started in your community using your project with no strings attached. Now, my favorite book, Effective JavaScript. It's from ages ago. What I loved about the structure of this book was that it started each chapter, each section, with some fairly easy to grok concepts around JavaScript. And throughout that section, it kept ramping up the detail and diving deeper and deeper and deeper. And finally, when you thought you couldn't take any more of it, the chapter was over and we moved back to the next section where we started at the bottom and ramped up. The great thing about this book was when I read it at the start of my JavaScript journey, it held so many things that I didn't know before, even if I couldn't understand everything at the end of that chapter. And then as I continued to reference the book throughout my journey with JavaScript, it revealed new secrets to me, new aha moments. What I'm trying to say here is that you want to teach learners wherever they are in their journey. A good resource yields nuggets of truth and wisdom as people revisit it over and over again. Documentation isn't just for new learners or super advanced learners or people who are working on architecture. Documentation is for everyone who has a question about your source. It's supposed to show people the years and years of architectural decisions that went into this without having to read through years and years of GitHub discussions. It's to give them that bird's eye view and help them dive deep where they need to. To this end, you can't always anticipate what background your audience has. We were very surprised to learn that 10% of React Native developers had no development experience when they started learning with React Native. 24% had absolutely no web experience. So this means that when we're writing documentation for React Native, we can't say things like, "You're probably familiar with this from JavaScript." We have to assume that people might not know what we're talking about. They may be a great Android developer, but have no idea how HTML and CSS works. We had to introduce some workarounds to accommodate people from all those different backgrounds. With React Native docs, we built in literal context switchers to speak to learners' personal experience. If there was a metaphor we could pull from Android, we would share it there. If there was a specific implementation detail for people from a web background, they can switch to that as well. Additionally, unlike videos or code comments, documents show up in search results, and they're easily translatable using extensions like Google Translate. So not only is documentation an excellent source of truth for learners, it also is an extremely resilient, searchable, and repackageable source of truth. Your first source of truth is, of course, your source code. Asking folks to just read the source, though, can be a little bit like asking them to just read the manual. As your source code grows, it becomes harder to expect people to be able to read through all of that content and understand the decisions that were made in the context that was there. You end up asking people to dive through hundreds of hours of development decisions in just a couple of days. That's when you need to start interpreting the source. It's on us to interpret the source as documentation, the next best thing. Docs are then consumed and referenced by all the exciting content, books, blogs, videos, courses, newsletters, tutorials, things that your community creates, things that your partners create, things that people who are working on your platform want to create for their coworkers. But if the docs are corrupted, if the docs aren't 100% accurate, then they can become a source of toxicity for that content. If all of this wonderful blog, video, etc., diverse forms of content dispersal have been negatively impacted by an incorrect or out-of-date API reference, for instance, then the documentation becomes a part of a problem. It is no longer a canonical source of truth. All right, so maybe you're thinking, let's just go out there and write some docs. It sounds like docs are the solution to all of our problem, right? But hold on there. Docs are not a one-and-done solution. Once you write docs, you must commit to keeping them up to date and current with that source. Otherwise, they can fall out of date. You can end up with something like doc rot. Doc rot is as soon as you release docs, the very next time you change your source code, unless you update those docs, they're falling out of date. Docs can also rot because of external factors. Say one of your dependencies updates, and then you have to go back through all that integration documentation and update it to match. You can't control how your docs age. You can only control how often they're updated. You have to keep on top of your docs to ensure that they are accurate and up to date and do not rot. Yet at the same time, you must walk that fine line of keeping many versions in history for people who are still working on older versions of your project. It is a very exacting place to be in the development lifecycle. But it's true, without continued investment, your docs depreciate like a newly purchased car. And if you don't invest in your documentation, users are unlikely to tell you. They just leave your platform. They just give up. If two products sitting side by side are exactly the same, but one has superior documentation, users flock to the one that they can learn faster and better and understand easier. So in a way, documentation is part of your competitive advantage when on a marketplace where the learner has their own choice. So let's talk a little bit about how investing in your documentation pays off. Now, on React Native, we reached out to our community, we ran surveys, we asked hard questions. We asked for people to tell us what they didn't like, what wasn't working, and we learned a lot. We learned that we needed more refresher material on React. A lot of people had to go to React stocks before they could start with React Natives. Learners wanted more visual content, more examples that showed them what they were going to get. We lacked in-depth content on specialized topics that were important to different subsets of our audience. And our high-traffic component and API docs were severely out of date because they weren't a part of the release process. And of course, everyone wanted more interactive code. So we added a React refresher and got interactive sandboxes throughout the site. Now, because our documentation wasn't automated from source code, it was on us to find community members who'd be willing to help out and update the API docs individually by hand. This was a great way to bring the whole repo up to speed with the source code. And now that we've made updating the documentation a part of the release process, they aren't likely to fall out of date again. Brought in specialists from the community to write new docs on important features that people wanted, and added illustrations to help keep people engaged. These turned out to be some of the most popular pieces of content on the site. In fact, this effort, it led to a 70% increase in people's overall ratings of the site. This is phenomenal. Now, was it the illustrations? Was it the additional content? Was it the updating the API references? Who's to say? But this is a really nice gain to see. Now we're putting all these lessons into action on React docs. Super excited about this. We have heard the community. We've asked questions. We've reached out to so many people, and we want to teach people how to think in React. And we're already seeing some promising results. In alpha testing, users were 3 times more likely to recommend our new React documentation than the existing documentation. So that's our story. But here are some ways you can make your docs rock. Grow your core. So Vue and React have documentation as a part of their core team. This is an excellent thing that you should consider doing. Your core team is responsible for writing code and often also takes on responsibility for writing documentation. I have found that documentation is an excellent way to onboard new core contributors to the repo. Asking potential new core members to update existing content or create new content for new features is an excellent way to acquaint them with your code base. Are you afraid that nobody knows enough to write documentation for your project? That's an excellent excuse for starting to mentor somebody. Now, perhaps you're not a maintainer. Perhaps you want to be a contributor and you have a favorite project in mind. Well, go offer to take on their documentation in return for mentorship from their core team. Making your own documentation site doesn't have to be too difficult. Maybe you start with a README. Maybe you're ready to create a portal that has API documentation and tutorials. You can find some pretty cool out-of-the-box doc solutions, such as Docusaurus. Relay and React Native run on Docusaurus, and there are all kinds of plugins available for interactive examples. It handles translations and versioning right out of the box, making a lot of these tricky questions easier to tangle with. And don't just let your docs sit there. Make updating them a part of your release process today, and always ask your community, how can we do better? Documentation is all about follow-through. They are a marathon, not a sprint, but it's a marathon 100% worth the hard work at the end of the day. Invest in your educational materials, and your community will thank you for it. Thank you for having me. Now, if you excuse me, I think it's time that I head off to my sauna. Have a great conference.
My mic was muted. Hey everyone, so there is one question, and it's about how do you keep track of the doc rod and maintain the tasks in the growing? Is it a part of your project's release cycle? So when you release something, it has to go with docs.
So this is a very good question. There are a couple of different ways to do this, and I can't say whether we are using any of them in the React project. I do know projects that have been deploying these and having good success. One thing you can do is collectively measure the age of your pages and take a look at which pages are getting the most down rankings and also are the oldest, and have a dashboard that makes sure that, when people are onboarded or joining the team, they can see which pages are the most out of date and getting the worst rankings. That content needs to be revisited. Another thing is to create integrated tests for the examples in your documentation and, run them every time a new release goes out, or run them on a regular basis. And when they fail, that's a signal that these examples aren't working anymore. Go over to them. But these are things you need to think about. They're probably beyond the scope of an individual open source project's abilities. But for people on larger teams who are thinking seriously about docs as a product, docs as a value proposition, it makes sense to invest in setting up your metrics for page age, last edited, user input and feedback about those pages, and having a collective dashboard where people can go and kind of see those problem spots, and building in the testing mechanisms for those examples from the start can go a long way to ensuring that your documents stay up to date. Now, once again, making documentation a part of your release process is a great way to make sure that your docs are in lockstep with your releases. And that is something that anybody can do. You put it on your pre-flight checklist when you're cutting a new branch. Did we go through the docs? Did we hit everything that this feature touches? And it's a little bit, you have to do it by hand, but smaller projects, scaling is less of a necessary investment at that point. But investing in automation for larger projects, that can also be helpful and ensure that the docs stay up to date automatically. But that's an excellent question.
Sorry. I have one question that's kind of related to that. How do you make sure that the translations of the React website are kept up to date with the English version of the React website?
We actually have a system for that.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. carry on.
We do. We're going to have to. We're going to have to update that with the new documentation release. But actually, Docusaurus that I mentioned, it has like a button you flip, and it automatically integrates with. I think it's called. Oh my gosh, I've forgotten it. It integrates automatically with internationalization service. So you can just start letting people contribute to internationalization of the documentation with like the flip of a switch. React docs tend to use separate GitHub repos for each one of the languages that have like 2 maintainers on each of those repos. So it's a little bit more community hands-on, a little bit more manual. If you think, wow, that sounds like a lot to set up, there are ways to just enable it automatically as well.
Yeah, valid point. Okay, so our last question is, do you have any examples of gathering feedback from users that is not the classic, like thumbs up and thumbs down on this page?
Oh my gosh, I love this one too. So thumbs up and thumbs down is kind of a crude metric. It's something, you got to get some kind of information back about what are people doing on this page. You can stare at your Google Analytics day in and day out. It'll be like, people are bouncing on this page frequently.
Staring at it day in and day out would be kind of soul crushing.
That would be soul crushing. There are people who do that. I think they place too much value in metrics. Metrics means nothing if you do not understand the motivation behind the behavior. Did someone bounce because they couldn't find what they were looking for, or because they found exactly what they were looking for? I actually found a strong correlation between people spending a lot of time on some pages and then downranking those pages, implying that they were searching and reading that page for the information they were looking for and not finding it. So these are all inferences. Some things you can do is add a little comment box. Next.js does this with their documentation so that you can, get some feedback on why that is. You could have that automated to set up like a GitHub issue, and then you could kind of go through those issues and triage them in a private repo to see what was most important. MDN, they do a survey that goes out to 1% of the visitors, and it collects some base metrics about, what did you come here looking for? Did you find it? Was the information easy to reach, etc.? There are things you can use as well, such as, I don't like to suggest using it, but you can do things to ask people like, how useful was this content? Would you recommend it to somebody else? And you can get an overall baseline metric for your documentation when you do that. And you can track that and create kind of a documentation health score from that. So you can use multiple metrics to feed into something that gives you a better idea of like, are the docs stinky and out of date and everybody hates them and we need to work on this? Or, oh, we got some problem areas that we should work on, but otherwise everything's still going great.
Like your dream project would have all of this information, including the metrics and everything in one dashboard, correct?
Ideally, right now, like my dashboards include like Google Analytics over here, custom inputs over here. Oh, what's this? It's a survey form from a completely different service over there.
So, exactly. If one wants to start contributing to the React docs, how would you say they can start?
I actually think it's easier to start contributing to a project that doesn't already have people working on the documentation in a push like this. It's kind of hard to contribute to React's documentation in the middle of a rewrite. I would actually say that the best thing to do is for our repo, oh gosh, it's right there on GitHub. You can, if you see something that's incorrect or you want to update it, you just go hit the edit this page button and it creates a pull request with your edit. And if it makes it in, that's awesome. You've contributed. Another thing to do is to coordinate with the maintainers of the repo, such as myself, about landing larger contributions. Of course, there is an overarching roadmap, and not all community contributions will line up with the roadmap. For instance, it might not be the right place to document how to use Vue, for instance, just off the top of my head. So that's something to consider as a person who's coming in and wanting to contribute to an open source project. You have to really be aware of what the maintainers of the project are trying to do and the direction that they're going and coordinate with them. It's a good idea to, I would say, pitch yourself as part of an editorialship team. People who can start with proofreading, start with contributing missing pieces of the documentation, and then ramp up and start taking on things that are on the actual roadmap.
Would you say that if the person's not a native English speaker, that it's also a good way to start with the translations?
Oh my gosh, that is absolutely brilliant. Yes, that's another way. I didn't want to say it because I feel like, well, there's a lot of people who are going to be like, but I only speak English. I can't do that. But if you happen to speak more than one language, yes, being a part of the translation effort is an excellent way to give back to the community. It's a brilliant way, actually.
No, yeah, no, I completely agree. I completely agree.
Ooh, I wanted to add another one up there. Say you are a person who is an excellent designer and you notice that there are some things that could be improved about the site's design. Pitching small tweaks, etc. That actually happened quite a bit with React Native's documentation, and the site vastly improved for it. If you're an illustrator, if you see concepts that would benefit from a diagram or an illustration, submitting those as a possible upgrade to the documentation, another great way to give back.
So anything that has to do with the UI, UX of the website as well, kind of like if you find any accessibility issues, please let us know.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. This is a great way to get your feet warm with the team.
Yeah. And I think it's also a great way to get started in open source, as in a lot of people find contributing to docs. I think translations as well. Like if you're from Finland, for example, like it is a good way to start with open source because it's not as daunting as fixing. Like it is a good way to start with open source because it's not as daunting as fixing a big like code bug somewhere, right? So yeah.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So Michael has a question. And
yeah, I'm curious.
Do you want to speak?
I'm curious about the doc rot problem with kind of you have a massive user community, and so those posts that go out, you don't actually control the content. Is there anything that you do to help kind of keep things up to date in the broader world of React content?
I'm not sure I quite follow. Would you mind rephrasing that?
Well, you have a ton of blog posts about the right way to do X in React, and the right way to do X in React is changing every year or two, I guess. And so, like, are there things that you do behind the scenes to try to make sure that the current thinking is properly elevated, I guess, in that content that you don't control?
So you're talking about community-generated content like posts on Medium and dev.to.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, this is what we call a wag the dog situation, where you get stadium projects where there's a very small core team and a huge community that consumes the production, and like they're going to create content. We can't go out and proofread all that content and tell them what to write. That's impossible. That does not scale. The most scalable thing that we can do is provide the best source of truth for them to create that content from. For instance, when people are asking questions on Stack Overflow, there should always be a link to somewhere in the documentation that should expand the right way to do something or the best way forward. In some cases, there is no right way forward. Like it's like the style situation right now. There's no formal recommendation. There are a lot of community solutions. That remains a conversation that happens in the community space. But if it's something where there is not mutating state, there should be canonical information in the documentation that people can reference. And then you find that the community tends to course correct. People show up in each other's comments and be like, yeah, well, I've literally seen this with the existing docs. Yeah, well, the existing docs say this isn't the correct thing to do. Oh, my bad. I'll update my post. So documentation is a great way to, seriously, it is the best thing you can give a community for them to edit and police each other's writings. Now, can you go back and change everything that came before? No. You're going to have to hope that Google's algorithm continues to prioritize the most up-to-date and canonical resources as opposed to surfacing things from like 2016.
Yeah, I don't think there's really anything that you can really do. And I feel like this is a problem for you as well, Michael. I think you want
I think it's a problem for everybody in the space.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Encouraging
Okay.
more documentation, better documentation. Let's put it that way.
It
Yeah.
is the gift that keeps giving.
Yeah.
Okay, Rachel, thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for your talk and for your willingness to answer all these questions. I hope you have a beautiful day, and hope to talk to you soon again.
I'll stick around.
So, okay, so you're gonna stay here after I said that. That's not weird at all. Like when two people say bye, but then they go in the same direction, and it's just awkward. Okay, so next up, she's still there. God, Rachel. Okay, so next up we have Michael, which you've just heard. He's part of the team that makes Storybook and also Chromatic, not Chromatic UI. I've used it. I know what it is. It does like storybooks to check if your things have broken in between. Takes photos, really great tool. And he's going to introduce a new format to be used in Storybook and just give us a round about how to document your components with stories and all the beautiful stuff. And yeah, Michael, take the stage.
Hi, my name is Michael Shilman, and I lead a project called Storybook. Storybook has a unique approach to documenting your React components using something called stories. And today I'm really excited to explain to you what that means and show you some demos. Let's check it out. If I was designing a documentation system from scratch, it would probably look something like this diagram. On the left, we have the input. Maybe it's Markdown, maybe it's MDX, maybe a WYSIWYG editor. And on the right, you have a documentation site. There's a lot of examples of systems like this. General systems like Next and Gatsby, kind of component development systems like Doxy, StyleGuidist, Docusaurus. Storybook is different from these tools in that it's not a first principle design. Instead, it's an evolutionary, pragmatic design on top of a tool that was already popular and already really widely used. And I think it's interesting to go through that evolution because where we ended up is something that's pretty unique, powerful, and as we'll see, potentially complementary to a lot of other documentation systems out there. So the best way to understand Storybook is simply to use Storybook. So I'm going to take you on a quick tour of a Storybook. This is the BBC's SAMED component library, a collection of UI components used across the BBC's web properties, all built and tested in Storybook. Here is an example of a header. This header has different states. Maybe there is a link on the right-hand side. Maybe it's a right to left version. And then you can play with it in various ways. You can look at it in a blurred vision simulator or maybe grayscale. You can look at it on a mobile phone layout. You can play with the content of it. Maybe you want to see what this looks like in a Burmese script. And so on. You can do accessibility checks on it. This is an accessible component with 6 passing tests. And then you can do this for every component, for every interesting state of the component. Most of the components in this particular library are atomic components. Here's kind of a media player component. What does it look like when there's offensive content? What does it look like for audio media? And so on. And Storybook is great for capturing all of these states, for automatically testing these states, and for documenting these states. And it works for everything from these atomic components all the way up to entire pages. So that was a pretty low-key introduction to Storybook, but I don't want to undersell how powerful a tool it is. A lot of front-end teams depend on it today. Here's a quote from Adam Neary at Airbnb. "The tool we use for editing UI is Storybook. It's the perfect place to make sure your work aligns with designs to the pixel across breakpoints." They were one of the first companies to kind of adopt Storybook wholesale. The Twitter web design overhaul was all done in Storybook. The Slack UI was built in Storybook. Pretty much a lot of modern software you use today was built in Storybook. And what this means is that thousands of teams across the industry are writing millions of stories. So given that context, this slide might make a little more sense. Really, the question we're asking is not how do we design the perfect first principles documentation system, but instead, How do we help teams get the most documentation value out of their stories with the least amount of work? The first thing we built and released just about exactly 2 years ago was something called Storybook Docs page. The idea here was to automatically turn all your existing stories into documentation. Let me show you what that looks like. This is how to write a story in Storybook. On the left-hand side, we have a file button.stories.tsx. It exports a default metadata about the component, and then it defines a set of named exports. Each named export is a story, and we can see all of those stories on the right-hand side in Storybook. If we look at the first story here, basic is a function that takes some args, which are basically props in React, and spreads those into the component, and then it sets the default args for the story. So if we go in here and we edit this, we can see it updating in near real time. And it's also worth noting that these stories can be written in more typical JSX if you prefer. Now let's take a look at Storybook Docs. Storybook installs a Docs tab out of the box. So we've got our basic story here. When we click over the Docs tab, we see that story. We see some markdown documentation, which is grabbed from a JS.doc comment on the component itself. There's other ways to set it. We see the story in a frame here. We can look at the source code. We can play around with the story, and we can see both the story and the code updating in real time. So it's got some nice features there. And then in addition to that, we also have all the stories that we've already written in one place on the page. And this all comes for free with no extra work required. But what if you want more control of your documentation? This is where we get back to the first principles design, and we built Storybook MDX, which is an MDX flavor that is fully compatible with Storybook so that you can author your stories in Markdown and get all the rest of the benefits of the Storybook ecosystem, like testing, like design handoff, and so on. So for MDX, let's take a look at ReaViz. ReaViz is a data visualization component library by Austin McDaniel and one of the early adopters of Storybook Docs. So on the left, we have our input, which is MDX. MDX is a flavor of Markdown that allows arbitrary JSX. So up top, we have a meta block here, which situates this in the Storybook documentation tree. We have some badges here, and then we have typical Markdown. If we go down and look at some of these other docs, we see kind of typical introductory documentation with examples sprinkled throughout. We have examples for each of the chart types. These are rich custom docs with source code, with API, and all of these things are really easy to put together in Storybook. So let's take a look at the source code for one of these. We have a hive plot here. On the left-hand side, we have the MDX. Again, up top, we have a meta block which situates this in the hierarchy. We have some Markdown. We have here a story block. Story block allows you to refer to externally defined stories. You can also define stories inline in Storybook MDX. And then underneath that, you have a bunch of Markdown, code snippets, and so forth, what you would expect. So next, I'd like to introduce the concept of doc blocks. Doc blocks are reusable documentation components, and you've already seen some of these in the demo. So this is args table, one of our most powerful doc blocks. It is auto-generated API documentation for your component, auto-generated controls for manipulating your stories. It's got a compact view if you just want to see controls. It's got the ability to group all this stuff into sections and subsections for components with big surface areas. It has got a whole variety of controls ranging from kind of an object editor to Boolean toggle to color swatches and so on and so forth. We've got a bunch of other doc blocks that are bundled in Storybook. We've got a color palette. We've got a description block that you've seen as well. We've got an icon gallery. We've got this preview block, which is sort of a composite block. You've seen that as well. We've got the source block with different syntax highlighters, the story block that you've seen. And the basic idea is everything that we present to you in Storybook Docs, we want you to be able to compose these things flexibly and easily. But one of the great things about Storybook is that it's extensible. And here's a fantastic example of that. This is MDX Embed, which introduces a whole bunch of useful doc blocks for Storybook. It's got a CodePen doc block. It's got a Figma doc block for embedding designs in your documentation. It's got a YouTube doc block for embedding videos. So in summary, Storybook doc blocks are a really cool way to supercharge your documentation. So the last thing I want to show you today is Storybook Embed. This is in early development right now, but it is our vision for the future of Storybook docs and even for Storybook as a whole. So the first generation of Storybook Embed has already existed for a couple years. It was integrated into InVision Design System Manager, Zero Height, and Frontify, all of which are sort of cross-disciplinary, hosted WYSIWYG documentation editors. So suppose I want a nice WYSIWYG interface for my designers and product people to edit my design system. Here's an example from Zero Height. This is a WYSIWYG editor. I can add images, add design assets, all sorts of other stuff. One of the things I can add is Storybook docs. So if I click here and paste this URL from the ReaViz example we saw earlier, I can embed my story inline. And this is great because now I have my live production component in my documentation. So this next part is very early stage, but it turns out that when you expand the Embed API, you can do some really cool things. I'll show you a great integration from UXPin design tool, and we've got some other big plans for next year along the same lines. So this is the UXPin integration. UXPin is a design tool, much like Sketch or Figma, that allows you to draw with vector graphics and create interactive prototypes. And with Storybook, it also allows you to embed your production components inside those same designs. So this is their example of taking the Audi design system and importing it into UXPin with a couple clicks. Once the design system is embedded, you can drag out components, and these components are your stories, and then you can interact with them just like any other vector drawing. These are responsive and interactive. So it's a really powerful way of reusing your assets and keeping your designs up to date with what's going out in production. There you have it, a quick tour of Storybook docs, what we were aiming to do, what we built, where we're taking it. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you would like to learn more, please check out the Storybook website, storybook.js.org. If you'd like to follow me, my Twitter is mshilman. Storybook's Twitter is storybookjs. And now I will open it up for questions. Thank you.
I was muted again. Hi, Michael. That was a great talk. I've been using Storybook for years. I use it now at the newest company that I'm in, and to be honest, it's one of those things that just it keeps getting better, keeps getting more useful with time, which is a very good thing. Exactly. It's just
music
it's
to my ears.
Nice. Yeah, like
Thank you.
I've never used the Markdown part, to be honest, until I joined this company, and it's super nice. It's just super
Cool.
super nice. Yeah.
Thank you. It's a work in progress, so we're still pushing on it quite a bit.
Yeah, I feel like everything right now is, there you go. I feel like everything right now is kind of a work in progress. I feel like it's one of those tools that keeps getting improved and keeps getting worked on. Nothing is ever really finalized. I think that's the problem and beauty of open source.
A bottomless well of work and
yeah, exactly.
incremental improvements. Yeah.
You're never going to be bored. There's way too many issues for you to ever be bored. Do you have anything that you would love to see in Storybook? That even if it's maybe not coming today, maybe not coming even this year, it's something that you would really, really like to see in Storybook?
I mean, for me, like I kind of hinted at it in the talk. When we started Storybook Docs, we didn't really know what we were getting into. We were grafting basically a second product on top of the first product. And it shows if you use it. So where we want to take it is in this kind of embedding direction. And if you look at some of these tools, whether they are tools like Next.js and Gatsby, whether they are kind of development oriented like Docusaurus. Like these are great tools that have put a ton of effort into building out documentation, whether it's customizing the styling and kind of the interactivity, or whether it's internationalization. Like there's so many different things, you can't do everything. And in Storybook, we've always kind of focused on the stories, we focused on the examples, and kind of doing more and more around the stories, making them more and more useful in different ways. And so Storybook Docs is one aspect of that. The place where I'm really excited to take it is to actually make those more and more embeddable, both the stories and the rest of the doc blocks outside of Storybook in tools that were built for the job of documentation. And so where I see the project heading is like right now, when you write Markdown, for example, in VS Code, you can go see the Markdown in another window and it's right there and it's super useful, but that's not what you're publishing to the world. And so to me, like where I want Storybook Docs is to be something similar to that, but for your components with your auto-generated API docs and so on. And then when you want to build a really nice production design system or what have you, then you can pick the best tool for the job and reuse your stories in that tool. So we just kind of, we have like a zillion users of Storybook. We have a zillion users of Storybook Docs. Everybody wants to do something different, and like we don't want to boil the ocean. And so I'm hoping to kind of build a bridge between Storybook and these other tools so that we can focus on what we do best. And that's probably like my #1 desire for next year.
Okay, so anyone who's watching us on YouTube, please feel free to send in your questions, and I will say them out loud. But for now, I also wanted to talk to you about the fact that like that's also a problem with being so extensible, right? You have so many like community-made plugins.
Yep.
Yeah, that's like how do you handle that as sort of like do you get a lot of issues? Do you have to run into a lot of problems with these types of situations?
We have been very consistently ambitious to try to just do as much as we can. And I think that like that has caused us to do all sorts of crazy projects that we never intended to do, and get in our head in all sorts of different ways. But that's pretty much been the guiding philosophy, is just really try to go big, go everywhere, do as much as we can, and we haven't died yet. So that's kind of the we have a ton. We have about 500 add-ons for Storybook. We have a ton of different way, even lots of commercial services built on top of Storybook that we have to worry about breaking when we change it. We're in the middle of a massive rewrite of the core right now for performance reasons. And it's incredibly scary because we have this giant surface area. So I think as the project matures, we'll probably try to tighten all that down a bit. But in the meantime, we're just living with it and dealing with stuff as it comes.
When it comes to the refactoring, I just want to ask if you are you using a typed language to write Storybook?
Yeah, Storybook was originally written in JavaScript. It was rewritten in TypeScript a couple years ago, and the refactor is also written in TypeScript. And
okay. That should make it slightly easier. Yeah, that should make it
useful,
easier.
But it's not a panacea.
Oh yeah, like that should make it easier, but take longer.
yeah, totally.
You can't have everything, right? Okay, so I think for now that's in terms of questions. Is there anything else you want to say about the upcoming work, or just in general about yourself?
No, just check it out. Everybody, give it a shot if you haven't used it recently. As Sarah said, it's constantly getting better.
It is definitely getting much better. I can assure you that it does have dark mode, and it's pretty good. It has a dark mode now. Okay, so thank you so much, Michael. Thank you so much for your work on Storybook as well. Before we go to our next speaker, I want to show that in 2019, before the world went to crap, when we went to Finland, they gave us a rock as a speaker present that I still have. Oh, God damn it! I thought Patrick was gonna grab it, and he just went to get water. Patrick, that was weird. Okay, yeah, I just wanted to show this rock that went through airport security, and apparently not for everyone, but it went through mine airport security because I don't know, in Berlin they don't really check anything. But yeah, that was a thing that's still there and reminds me of a time before COVID when I flew to Finland. Remember flying? Yeah. So, oh, I'm the only one who has a rock. I see. Oh, I see. They don't have a stone. I want rocks. Okay, Rachel, I'll send you some Berlin
I
rocks.
definitely need more rocks in my life.
I'll send you Berlin rocks. That's something that you want. I will break up this rock apart and I will send to all of you, my friends. Okay, so our final speaker is Patrick. He is very enthusiastic about ReScript. He's very enthusiastic about it ever since I met him. And I've met him like 3 years ago, like before anyone even knew that Reason existed. He made a conference about it. Like very enthusiastic person about it, which is not a bad thing. I'm just setting up the stage for whatever he's going to talk about that I do not know because it does not say on the website. So I am going to bet this rock that I was just holding, that is going to be about Reason. But I'm not sure. Okay, so Patrick is great. Please enjoy this talk that I am almost certain is going to be about Reason and documentation.
Thank you for the introduction. You're almost right, Sarah.
Okay, who gets the rock?
Yeah. I wish I had the rock though. I didn't. I don't know why I didn't get it. Maybe I wasn't a speaker at that time. I'm going to share my screen because I'm doing it live, actually. I didn't know that everyone is... Yeah, I thought it would be more fun.
I can leave my mic on so that you can hear me laugh. Yeah, I usually have my wife, like, in the other chair so that she laughs at my jokes and I don't feel so sad and alone.
Oh.
So,
it's I think it's fun. I actually do some streaming on Twitch if you're interested in this kind of stuff, but currently on a break because summer was so hot. Anyway, so thank you for the introduction. So my surprise talk is going to be the story of ReScript's documentation platform. More on that Reason and ReScript thing later, because this is actually quite relevant for the core of this talk. It will be a very, very different kind of talk. Probably not even the one I would have expected, to be honest, but let's see. So first of all, we're going to talk about ReScript just to establish some context, because probably, I don't know, 70% of all the folks watching this stream have never heard about it, most likely, or maybe just in a tweet or something. Give a little bit of context on the history, what the challenges were back then on the documentation, and how we took this like technical debt or community debt or legacy thing and formed a new documentation platform out of that with some technical details, some how we did analytics, metrics, and so on, and also a few things not as detailed as the previous speakers did about like technical writing, content creation, and stuff like that. This was like a magnificent talk about React Native. I could not imagine like managing a project like this, but we also had our burden to handle here, and also a little bit about community, because community is very important also for documentation as well. So also to give you some more context, so I'm working for a company that uses ReScript in its product, and the product is actually quite old. It's a few years old. Like the code base itself, it's written in Flow and JavaScript, and we are partially integrating ReScript in there to slowly migrate it over to ReScript. We think it's a great technology, and it's definitely something worth looking at if you're interested in this kind of stuff. So what is it? So this is like the elevator pitch, so to say, just to give you some context. ReScript is a robustly typed language that compiles to efficient and human-readable JavaScript. It comes with a lightning-fast compiler tool chain that scales to any code base size. So this is a lot of like marketing text here. So we try to split it up a little bit. When we talk about a robustly typed language, what we mean is that we are having a language that at any point in time has always 100% type coverage. It's not as you would expect with languages like, I don't know, TypeScript or Flow, where you have a gradual type system that would introduce certain unnicecities, for instance, to be able to map to JavaScript, because, for instance, TypeScript tries to cover the whole JavaScript spec. It needs to introduce concepts like anytypes. And anytypes and stuff like that kind of bleeds through your whole code base and makes the code a little bit less reliable. This is a trade-off in the whole language to be able to use JavaScript as is. And ReScript is a little bit more of its own language, but it kind of looks like JavaScript, and it compiles to human readable JavaScript. So we don't try to be JavaScript, but we're kind of like making it easier for JavaScript developers to understand it and read it. And the more important aspect here, which might be relevant for one or two persons here in the stream, it comes with a lightning fast compiler toolchain, which means the type checker, the build system, like the compiler itself that compiles the code emitting, everything of this stuff is lightning fast in a millisecond range per file, which means if you have a code base of 1,000 files, it would just take a couple of seconds longer to do a clean build than when you have like just 100 files. It doesn't matter. It really scales with the requirements. As far as I know, and that's why I'm interested in this stuff, whenever I've been working on like more ambitious projects in TypeScript, it oftentimes ended up in like a lot of caching and a lot of extra architecture to be able to handle huge compilation, like huge project compilations. And this is not fun, waiting for the compiler to succeed and then suddenly like running into invalid caches in VS Code is just not fun at all. And ReScript tries to mitigate that by having a design that's fast and performant by design. So there's also like a search on the JavaScript side where people start getting invested in Rust and use, I don't know, like rebuild Webpack in like a native compiler or whatever. You can imagine ReScript being like a type checker compiler, like the whole tool chain, like in one thing, as fast as SVC or what was it? Now I can't remember the tool which is like replacing Webpack or doing the same thing. Anyways, it's fast. Here's a small example. I will not go too much into the syntax, but the idea is that you can see that, okay, we have like a switch, we have like a let to assign a variable, we have JSX built into the language, so it's also optimized for React usage, and it kind of compiles. If you look at the right side, you can see that this is actually, yeah, this looks like a React component. It's a function, it takes some props, it has like a props.count, and creates an element which is like the desugared JSX, so we don't need any bubble or whatever in between. So this is actually quite nice. It's like one npm install away. You can integrate it in any existing code base and then just happily create one, I don't know, one React component and integrate it in your code base. Some other features in this feature set. So there is a focus on functions, values, and pipe operations. So there are no classes in, like there's no concept of classes in ReScript, which is actually great, because if you have been like looking at utility libraries like Lodash or Ramda or whatever, they usually come with a pipe function to pipe together, to chain together multiple like transformations if you map over data or reduce over data and do some stuff. And in ReScript, this is like a first class thing. You don't need a separate library just to do this kind of thing. And another good thing about detaching values and functionality that transform these values is that it's way easier to actually tree shake stuff. If you think about certain libraries like Moment.js is using a lot of like class-like structures where they involve the whole thing in one bundle. And this is not very easy to tree shake, because they need to ship everything, because the state and the methods and the data is all coupled in one class. So we don't do that. So it's just kind of feels kind of like a subset of JavaScript, but also adding a few features which are nice. We have immutable record types, for instance. If you're familiar with immutable.js or with Immer, the problem there is that if you use an immutable.js library, it involves certain runtime. So you need to convert back and forth between immutable data structures. If you have been using this in React, this has also probably be a pain on memory pressure, because they create a lot of like in-memory data, which the runtime needs to keep track of. And here we don't have that. We just have like, we compile it to JavaScript objects, but we enforce the immutability on the type checker level. We have variance and pattern matching, which is extremely useful for UI development. So if you're doing like very complex state transitions and you have like disabled buttons, and then you have like a few requests there, and you have like loading screens and loading components everywhere, variants are an incredible tool to basically design your component state before you even write any code, just expressing them as types. You can also imagine them as a linear version of a tagged union in TypeScript. They are pretty darn useful for refactoring as well. When you're like adding a new variant and a new case, like a new UI state, and then the compiler will guide you through the whole code base where you're missing out on this pattern match. And the pattern match looks like a switch in our case. Anyways, there's like an extra feature there. Plain ReScript code doesn't have any concept of null and undefined because we have variants. We usually express them as an optional, kind of like in Rust. They also have like options. And so basically, we remove a whole category of checking null and undefined, or null and undefined, which is really nice on the readability of the code. We have to build in JSX support, what I said before, and it's very easy to integrate in existing JavaScript, TypeScript code bases. We even have like functionality to generate TypeScript types from ReScript code, which is usually easier than the other way around. Because we don't have any types and such, it's a little harder to go the other way around. We cannot really generate types from TypeScript to ReScript though. Our target group is also very important because if you're writing documentation, you always need to be sure whom are you designing this for. And on the language level, it's even more important because otherwise you don't have any goals to achieve, right? If you don't know who you're making this language for, why bother? So what we are trying to do is we try to build a language for React developers, for JavaScript developers. We're trying to build in complex UI that is later easy to adapt and refactor at any scale. And this is not only fluff. Like from my experience, my personal experience, of course, it was always very easy to adapt code that has been like more than 1.5 years old. Never had a problem trying to figure out what I did. There was never a problem figuring out what types were involved, and also like the way how you edit code is a little different because you don't have any import statements and stuff like that. So you don't have to wrangle like with the import paths and stuff like that. So it's kind of a nice experience if you can just create a file and just use that component as if it would be globally available. And other target groups are, as I mentioned before, Flow and TypeScript users that are kind of fatigued by this unreliable JS types with slow compilation types, times type checking, stale caches and such. If you have been working on a huge TypeScript code base and you needed to check out a new branch, and then you had to wait like 5 to 6 minutes just to rebuild the whole thing, otherwise VS Code showing the wrong things. Yeah, this is something ReScript tries to solve. Or for other people like me, I'm getting kind of fatigued by this very complex type definitions TypeScript allows, because it has a lot of magic types and it needs that to map to the JavaScript world. But sometimes you're just looking for a simpler language that still works with JS, and you don't want to worry too much about like type acrobatics and stuff. Okay, so this is like the broader context. I hope it's not too much, but let's talk about its history. Now it's getting really messy because this sounds very lean, right? So what I just described is just, this is like it's just a few sentences, one mission, and this is what we try to achieve. But previously it was not that easy. So let's have a look at ReScript's history back then, how it came to be. So 2016, there was a compiler called ReScript, and there was a syntax called ReasonML, which was developed by Facebook. ReScript was developed within Bloomberg. And in 2016, they kind of banded together to create a language that is kind of looks like JavaScript, but can compile to different platforms. For instance, to native code like Go or Rust, and also to JavaScript kind of with the ReScript workflow. And they also added Reason React bindings to kind of, bind to React and cater to this React use case I was talking about. And this went along until 2019. It was like 3 years. I was deeply involved with this. I also organized like 2 conferences in the meantime, until there was like this discussion on what should we focus on, because like this 2 ways, native and kind of JS, and both workflows, they don't really mix together. They are kind of different, and also the communities are kind of different. So we kind of needed to separate these 2 worlds. So in 2020, we introduced the new syntax implementation, which was written completely from scratch, a handwritten parser, which has nice error recovery, which is like super fast, like 10 times faster, and specifically made for ReScript and the JavaScript use case. And in August, it was like completely rebranded, and we relaunched our new documentation website and rolled out to our users, to our existing users and our new users. This was kind of like the rough bird's eye view. So we had a lot of legacy, and a lot of, you can imagine this was like a migration nightmare to tell existing users that they are now going to ReScript and it's not Reason anymore, as it's ReScript. So we had these 3 websites. And as you can see, like the Reason website is like orange, the ReScript is like purple, Reason React is blue. It was kind of confusing for our users. We saw this over the years, that people are like, oh, what is Reason now? Is it like the syntax, or is it like the whole language, or is what is ReScript in that equation? How does this work? And where do I find this information if I want to just use JavaScript? And this was indeed very confusing also for myself. We wanted to improve that during the rebrand. We wanted to make like one picture out of it. We wanted to we wanted the docs to reflect our language philosophy, so to say. We wanted to be simple, we wanted to be lean, we wanted to be cool. That's important. So there are a few steps involved to achieve this goal. And hopefully, maybe someone can pick some notes or some details out of it and use it themselves. I'm not sure. You can also ask me questions later if you want. So that very first step. And I was happy to have my wife supporting us in that regard. She has a tremendous eye for design in that regard, how to do the layout, how to put the focus on certain content, how to organize the sitemap and stuff like that. So we try to establish a design and implementation process similar like in a normal company, a normal project. Also, just in an OSS setup, we do this on Figma, and we also make it public as much as we can. And we created a single Next.js project. We started out, we had like 3 different Docusaurus pages. All of them were kind of on a different version, and all of them in a different state and different quality. And this was kind of jarring because there were 2 teams, and some of them, or like one person of one team, was working on all 3 projects separately. It was very hard to roll out like platform-related changes to the whole documentation landscape. Like if I changed something in the compiler, I needed to update the React docs as well, right? So this was a huge dependency hell there. So we created one single Next.js project. We copied all the markdown files from all the other Docusaurus projects, put them in one folder. We emulated certain functionality we need from Docusaurus. We removed the localization thing, which I'm still trying to figure out how to do right. I mean, localization is probably the hardest problem in this whole thing. But we couldn't use Docusaurus there because we had specific requirements on how we manage our version documentation. We are a platform, we have a language. We need to keep track of syntax changes, the compiler changes, which is like one manual. And we also had to keep track of other resources that are kind of dependent on this. So this was something Dockersaurus couldn't do at that time, and that's why we did it that way. And also we wanted to have a nicer integration with like more control on the design with Tailwind CSS, and use React and ReScript to actually dog food or use our own tools to build our documentation, which is also a good reference for anyone who tries to dabble into ReScript. When we unified the information, we still kept the compiler and syntax doc separate, and it was still Reason and it was still BuckerScript. So it looked kind of like this. This was called reasonml.org in the beginning, which was an initiative of the organization, or like I founded together with 2 other board members, called the ReScript Association. Back then it was called Reason Association. We also rebranded that. Anyways, we have the language manual and the JavaScript sections, and as you can see, there's still the same structure, and it's still confusing. I mean, it's all on one page now, but it's still like separated knowledge that should belong together, kind of. Okay, so we started to simplify. We drastically condensed the content, so we merged the language and compiler docs as soon as we were sure how to move forward with the ReScript syntax. We created a version toggle to switch to older versions. We added an older document version so that we can still reflect the original Reason docs and BuckerScript docs for our existing users. We don't want to alienate anyone who has been like a production user. We want to make sure that the migration path is almost seamless. And we also did that with automatic migration, so people could just upgrade their Reason code to ReScript in one single command. And then they could use the most modern version of the docs, which were all in ReScript. We had to be very thorough. We had to remove all the wording that mentions Reason or OCaml or anything that could confuse our users, because if you go to a language page and you're like, okay, this language is called ReScript, you should not mention any other programming language. It would just add to the confusion, and it turned out to be like one of the biggest like confusion points. What I have noticed from my personal circle, whenever I talk to people, everyone was like, but is it now OCaml or is it now Reason or what is it? I was like, no, it's ReScript, everything's ReScript. Everything you see on the page is designed for that. But still, we wanted to make sure that the transition was easy. We added some analytics. This was actually bigger than I anticipated. Like, this was super important. I mean, it sounds weird, but we added simple analytics for tracking traffic from the HTTP side. It's an anonymous tool. You can actually inspect it if you go to the repo. There's a link to the analytics, so you can check it out yourself. The data is all open, which gave us a really, really good view on how the language develops. We hooked in Ahrefs, which is an SEO tool. They are also, I think, using ReScript on their platform as well, or at least Reason. So kind of a friendly company there. So shout out to Ahrefs for hooking us up with such a great tool. It helps us to keep track of backlinks, referring domains. It's really great because you can see if there's a new blog post referring to your website, you will see it in the summary, and you can also check it out in the UI, as you can see in the screenshot below. This is like a screenshot from Ahrefs. It's really, really great to discover what people are building with your language. We added Algolia search as well, the open source plan. And this one is actually also very useful because it gives you information on what kind of keywords people are looking at. Some are like Googling async await, some are Googling promises, some are inserting the keywords in your search bar on the website. So we know that these topics are important, so we can tackle them more easily. Here's a very interesting graph of our website since the start in August 2020. And you can see that, so first of all, we can ignore these huge spikes over there. These are just because either there was some interesting blog post or something, and this piqued a lot of interest. The very huge one in the middle is caused by Hacker News. As soon as something ends up on Hacker News, you can be sure that it's like spiking as hell. And as you can also see, there's like a continuous growth, at least from the first half to the second. And another interesting aspect here is you can see like this weird down edges on the right side. If you, I'm not even sure if I can, oops, no, I cannot really click on that. But on the right side, you can see the spikes down below. So these are like the weekends. So what I noticed is that these spikes are getting a little deeper, which means that maybe there are more production users that work from Monday to Friday and less people working on weekends or trying it out on weekends. So that's actually a good sign for stability. We also have like CI testing kind of, we kind of test documentation. So what we do is we have 2 different CI scripts. One that checks internal links in Markdown, which helps us in preventing broken links, which tremendously helped us like 404 pages, finding 404 pages. Ahrefs would also find that, but this is like too late. Well, if you merge something and there's a broken link in there, it's too late already. We have a script for testing ReScript code snippets in the API docs, which is very useful. So if we have like our API docs right there, I mean, this is like probably the wrong step, but we are now forced to maintain this whole docs manually. So if you have like an example as here, you can see some code snippets with is even, square, result. We wanted to make sure that these examples are 100% compilable, because people tend to copy paste your stuff. And if you copy paste stuff and it doesn't work, it's bad. You get a bad experience for your users. So this was very important to us. So we automated it and made sure that nothing breaks. And this was also a very tremendous tool when we migrated over from Reason. We just migrated all the examples. Then we run the check. We saw that everything was green and we were fine. So testing your Markdown is actually quite a useful feature. It's also not very hard because it's just a simple node script working on the AST of the Markdown, or iterating through the Markdown elements, basically. All right, so the last part, or one of the last parts, was after we finished up all this cleanup, simplification, optimization, we were setting up redirects from old sites. This is a very, very important aspect. We wanted to make sure that nothing, like no link, was breaking. The original site, bucketscript.github.io and reasonml.github.io, reasonml still exists, it's still its own project, but we had to migrate off our content and make sure that people don't get lost, because they have bookmarks and they want to follow the bookmark and go to the right resource. So we took our time and took days to figure out all the paths, all the URLs, and do an automatic redirect via Docosaurus HTML redirects or via our Next.js redirects. This was a lot of work. And in the beginning, I was not sure if it's worth it, but it actually pays off because Google is also following those links and will automatically index them correctly and does a proper canonical refer to the right resource. So if you're writing documentation, always make sure to not break your API links, basically. Try to redirect them if possible. For Reason React, we did it a little bit different because for the ways on how this documentation was designed here, we just added a deprecation warning, and we made sure that the deprecation warning looks on brand with what we have on our documentation platform right now, so people really recognize the brand. And this work actually paid off a lot. You could really tell from the analytics that people were referring from these old resources back to the original canonical resource. Yeah, this was a lot of work. And then we did some fine tweaking, some I don't know, like cool things kind of. So I once saw this this tool, but this one guy, I cannot recall the name right now, but he was doing like a lookup tool for operators, for JavaScript operators, like the smaller equal sign, greater than equals and stuff like this, or plus operator. And I thought this was a really good idea. Like you enter something, a keyword, or you're just looking for generic or whatever, and it will tell you the syntax for it. And maybe I will demonstrate it just a little bit. If you go to the docs, we have the syntax lookup right here. And so if I'm looking for generic, for instance, we will see, oh, this is generic. And then I can click on that, and then, oh, this is a type error emitter. So I'm reading some code, and I'm like, oh, what is this weird asterisk dot? And you're like, this is the floating point multiplication operator. Wow, okay, now I get it. And then you get some examples with some JavaScript output. You can try it out in the playground, and you're ready to go. And you have a much better time discovering the language. And I think this is such a great tool. I've never seen this for any other programming language, and I'm not sure why. So maybe someone can pick that up, that idea. That's really great. About the technical writing, content, and design. So not going to supersede the first talk here. It's just very bare bone. My most valuable learnings, basically. So most important thing, or my advice to anyone, understand your target group. It's such an obvious thing, but a lot of people are scared to define the target group. Sit down and write down whom you're targeting. Whom is this going to help? Choose a writing style, stick to it. It's important. Don't just switch around with styles. We chose a very direct style, very short style, because people don't read the documentation. Actually, if you write a blob of text, you can be sure that the most important bits will be missed. We collaborate, but we keep an eye on the full picture. Very important. Don't just blindly accept PRs just because they add something. Everything that adds to the documentation should be very carefully scrutinized. Keep it lean. And we treat documentation like an API. As I said, if you introduce a breaking change in a URL, make a redirect. And also, writing documentation is super scary, because if you're writing for a language, you're writing content, you're automatically like an authority in this topic. And not everyone is a specialist and doesn't feel like he or she is a specialist. So it's a matter of, the scariness is good, but you should also make sure to not get too scared, otherwise you will not write any documentation at all. For the community side, there is one interesting aspect. So the community is an important source of information. So what we did is we migrated off a real-time chat and launched a discourse forum. And the forum software has a lot of advantages. First of all, the thread system. It's asynchronous, so everyone can participate in the discussion. In a real-time chat, everything is kind of localized to a specific time zone. So if like people in the US wake up and they write something, the other people on the other end, like in Europe or Asia, they have no way to interact with them. They can read up on it, like on a stream of chat logs, but it's not possible to have a meaningful, deep discussion. And there is better search engine discoverability. Like the most important questions we have on ReScript, they point to our forum, to some, I don't know, 1-year-old post, and people can still participate in that. That's something. It's like mailing lists. They're also super useful. Real-time chat is not a replacement for this kind of format. You need this kind of format if you have a small community. Make sure to centralize that. It's also very useful to have some metrics on the community health. Discourse does a very great job giving you the tools to moderate it and give you some tips on how to grow it. It's a really, really nice extension of your documentation if you have people involved in the community and write about topics. On the contribution side, our community is still small, but we have one place to update all the docs, so this is great. People understand that. They know where to submit a PR to. We have lots of contributions from newcomers, actually, which is great. That means it works. And newcomers, actually, which is great. That means it works. And our CI deployment preview stuff is super useful. Kudos to Vercel and Next to make this so nice. And we have some pretty great feedback loops for mentoring. So I had like a few people who are constantly pushing content, and they are getting better and better and better with every pull request I review. And I'm always at a point that I'm like, okay, I see this person made a PR. I just merge it. I know it's good. I just read through it and I was like, okay, perfect. And this is great. This is really great to have people growing with you and just taking the advice. To wrap it up, we are still not there yet. There's still tons of things to do. Like writing docs takes time and thought. It's like writing a book. You need to really think about the content and how to structure it, and it's also scary. And if you go to our website, you will probably notice that there's a lot of stuff missing, but we are happy for any contributions. Content design, tooling, doesn't matter if you're interested in this kind of stuff. You can check out ReScript at rescriptlang.org and our documentation source code at the link below, rescript.association/rescriptlang.org. All right, so that's it. I hope you liked it, and yeah, see you around. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patrick. This was a really nice talk, and yeah, documentation and ReScript. I'm gonna keep my rock. Okay, our first question is actually from Rachel. So take it away, Rachel.
I really enjoyed hearing all about your approach to documentation, and I just want to say I really, really dig the syntax lookup tool. That's awesome. And such a clever way to give people a glossary for, like, I bet people just have that open as a quick reference. I wonder what the uses metrics around that are like. But I got a couple of questions for you here. One is, how are you handling versioning for the docs? That's something I think a lot of people forget about when they first start writing documentation. So how were you set up to handle it?
Yeah, this is a very underrated topic. That's true. So what we do is we have the platform, which is called the ReScript platform. It's containing the syntax and the compiler, and also the standard library. So what we did is we made it very simple. We have a pages folder. Within there are docs, and then there is like the manual with a major version. So for instance, we have the version V8, which is version 8, major version V8. Everything that's related to this major version will be updated in this docs. And then we also got a latest folder, which contains the latest version. We usually map that to a constant string, which is, I don't know, the most current version we keep track of. And later on, when we decide we have like a versioning scheme, so next year in January, we will release version 10. Then we will copy the latest folder into version 9 as the older 9 version, and just format the new latest version and git ignore the rest. We wrote about, which basically feature freeze the documentation for this particular versions, like the older ones. And the latest one is always the most current one. People should commit new changes to that.
Cool, thanks. I think Docusaurus uses something similar, but it does allow people to go back and edit the old pages, just in case there are some typos or something and people are really into one version. This brings up another question I've got for you. Do you have a roadmap for the documentation, or do you let the community guide how the documentation grows?
I tried, like in the past, like last year or so, I started to create milestones for the documentation itself, which kind of helped, especially if you're collecting like GitHub issues and you create a milestone and people are like, oh, I can chime in here, I can chime in here. This actually helps. The problem is that doing this roadmap work is real work. And we are kind of on a tight time budget. I would like to do this more regularly, more on the GitHub side, create a milestone for Q2 of 2021, for instance, and then communicate over the forum, hey guys or folks, we have a new milestone. If you have anything you want to commit, I'm happy to help you. Roadmap is actually quite a good idea.
I have one more question for you, but I want to leave room for any other questions that might have come up.
I think you can go. You can go. Yep.
All right. Here we go. How important would you say it is to involve what we typically consider non-engineers in the process of kicking off a documentation project? Like you mentioned collaboration on the UI and design side of things, like information architecture, et cetera. How has this impacted your project? How important do you think it is?
I wished we had bigger focus on involving more non-technical people. We tried really hard, especially in the past with ReasonConf and such. We tried to diversify our community a lot. We gave out a lot of diversity tickets. We reached out to more UI-related communities. We tried to reach out the React community, especially, even though they have nothing to do with like typed languages or whatever. But we tried to also involve other perspectives than just the code. Programming language communities tend to get really techy, and it's getting annoying for my side because people are talking about how could I express this very particular case in a type, and then they talk like days about it. And when you talk about how do you design a button, or how do you make sure that this interaction is not confusing or accessible, nobody has any clue. And it's yeah, I'm not sure how to actually tackle this problem, because either people are not interested in this like language itself, or they just want to use JavaScript only and don't care about TypeScript or whatever. They just want to create stuff, the more creative side. I don't know how to attract these people, but hopefully at some point there will be, I don't know. It's very hard.
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Because there was like this weirdly awkward silence, and I thought my internet had died. Just want to.
I wasn't sure if we should jump into conversations or if we should like jump into takeaways.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah. So, do you have any? Wait. There we go. Do you have any takeaways that you want to share about what Patrick said and in general about today?
I'll start. I would say my biggest takeaway was kind of a feeling of inspiration. As you could probably tell from my talk, I'm really a tools guy, and I started off the whole thing talking about documentation is kind of a headache, and it really has been in Storybook. And I just, from watching your guys' talks, feel much more kind of energized and inspired about our documentation.
You're not alone.
So it was really nice to hear those. That's my biggest takeaway.
Okay. Rachel?
My biggest takeaway, I mean, honestly, I've just been inspired seeing how you've been working on your documentation project and how you've been making documentation less painful. My biggest takeaway is that making it easier for people to engage in building the documentation is better for everyone involved in the community, making it easy for them to update, easy to contribute from all walks of life and all different skill sets.
Patrick? Yeah, so my takeaways, like, I was a little bit stunned by Rachel's talk, because like she talked about all the details I was like deeply caring about, and I was kind of surprised how well they did the research on the user base and do the surveys and stuff like that. I know this is a ton of work, and I really appreciate this kind of eye on the detail. So really great to have seen this.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, everyone. My main takeaway is that documentation is hard. Documentation is like building anything else. It takes work, it takes time, it takes a team. And I think that's the important thing, because a lot of the times it's treated as the goalkeeper of the team, as in like just one person has to go. I don't know why everything has to be about football now. I'm sorry. I've just been going through this phase where I just watch a lot of football, like European football. I just want to clarify that for Rachel right now. And then like it's probably gonna go down, but you know what I mean. It's like a lot of people think that it's just one person can write the docs, can do that part. It's like there's a docs person, they're the goalkeeper. They're gonna take care of that, and it's just not the reality. So yeah, thank you so much, all of you, for joining and for giving away your amazing talks. You are all great. You are all very useful to this community, very useful in like humanity levels as well. Very good peeps, very good specimens of human beings. And yeah, so we will all, by all, I literally just mean me in this case, all of us. I'll be back in about an hour and a half to talk about the other problem that happens a lot in front-end development, which is accessibility. So I hope you are all still excited to be here, because about in an hour and a half, we will be talking about accessibility, and I will see you all